something with one hand.
Yeah, sure, and hopefully it won't be long.
Mr. McGee, where were you and what were you doing when Pearl Harbor came?
Very interesting question. That Sunday afternoon, the radios came on with the news of Pearl Harbor, and as I recall, in the area, I was in the Gary, Indiana area, and actually heard the news. Among other things, as a young man, I was singing with a glee club. In fact, it was the Coleridge Taylor Glee Club, and we were going from Gary. It happened my dad was living in Gary at the time, and although I'd been in Chicago, I was out there, and we were going from Gary to I can't remember the community now. It was a community in the South Chicago area to sing a program, an afternoon vesper type program, and riding in the car, not my car, it was somebody else's car, but that news came over the radio about.
Was this glee club a college glee club, or?
No, it was really a community group, but I guess several from a few churches had gotten together, but it was an all-male group of, I recall, 12 to 14 voices.
What was your initial impression? What did you went through your mind?
Well, I guess a bit of a shock that something like that would happen, but I was in school, and part of my being in Gary was working in the steel mill there to get money to keep up my college education, and
where were you going to school?
Down at the University of Illinois, and then back up to Gary in the summertime and on the vacation periods from between semesters of school. And so my attention had not been drawn to what was really going on, but I do remember from the papers some of the discussion of the diplomacy that was going on with the Japanese diplomatic people who were visiting Washington in a bit, and felt that this was a shocking outcome because some of the news was tending to, make you believe that there was peace negotiations, or at least understanding, and nothing like this, farthest thing from anybody's mind that America would be attacked. I do vaguely remember in those days some talk in the papers about how much of scrap steel, and if I recall that the Japanese had been, buying and picking up in America, but it was kind of a remote thing, really, in mind as to what it really meant, except that it was shocking because I think even then there was the feeling that America was a strong country, even though we hadn't gotten far from maybe colonial relations with foreign countries, but the influence of America in the Pacific and so on was still one that added to that shock that we'd be attacked on the basis.
How did you get associated with the military?
Part of my schooling at the University of Illinois, and I don't know what drove me that way, but I had entered the ROTC program. Of course, it was an Army ROTC, and taken part in the Pershing rifle drill program. And just going through the introductory phases that your first 2 years give you, and of course, with the buildup of the war effort, I had to sign up for the draft, and had a draft card, and never knowing when that call might come. I had a brother who was 2 years older, and he did get called in, drafted to enter the service, and in that early part of 1942. In fact, it could have been even very late 41, but as I recall, it was in the very early months of 1942 that there was this rumor that Congress had approved the training of a squadron of black pilots, and I was able to get a hold of an application, and it was also interesting too in a decision point. They chose Chanute Field at Rantoul, Illinois, to train the ground elements, because this was being a totally segregated program. Not only were they going to train the pilots, but they had to train all of the ground support people. And Chanute Field is just 15 miles from Champaign-Urbana. Mm-hmm. And so there were a number of folks interested, and they were enlisting these non-flying people there at Chanute. And so even that word spread into the black community of Champaign. And when I was down there in school, and there was some talk, should we go up there and sign up? Well, as I say, I had gotten a hold of an application for the flying side of it and had submitted, and I think it apparently must have been between semesters that I was in Gary, and had put in the application, so I just said, well, I'll wait and see what comes of that application.
That raises an interesting question. Was ROTC integrated at the University of Illinois?
Yes, it was.
It was.
ROTC was, but and I never thought at the time, because I didn't enter it with the idea that I was going to end up and make a military career. I entered the engineering program, and one of the things offered, and as you look at needing hours to fill out your program, I had my basic courses, and I guess I had a couple hours left over, and rather than being satisfied with 12 and wanting a 14-hour semester, something like that, I said, well, I'll go take that to help have a full schedule. And as I can recall, that must have been the way it was, because I hadn't set out to say, when I go, I'm going to take ROTC with whatever else. I think it fell in to have a full schedule.
Kind of interesting that an enormously segregated military would have an integrated ROTC program.
Right. At least they accepted me in the basic. Now, whether what might have happened had I still been there to go into the upper phases, and it wasn't a part of my study or knowledge at all that there had been denial of, particularly because you look at being graduating with as an officer, going through all of that there were very limited assignments and ability to move into an area such as flying never had crossed my mind.
When did you go to Tuskegee?
Well, it turned out that in April of '42, I finally got a letter saying that my application for flight training had been accepted, and that I needed to pass a physical. And so from Champaign, and the nearest place was over in Indiana. It seems to me it was a Fort Bear or something like that, but an Army facility in Indiana, that I was given a date and time to go take a physical exam, which I did, and then back to school, and I'm waiting, and nothing happened. Went on to finish that semester, and summer came, worked to get back in school, and in the fall, September, about time for re-enrollment, although I didn't have direct word, I had received word that I had been accepted, and just had to continue to wait for the call. So I had completed 2 years at the university, which was required at that time. When the program first opened, you had to have your degree, and I had signed up at a time when you could do it with 2 years, so there in the fall, just after the semester opened, I got in my mail, you will report to Tuskegee, Alabama. Well, first they said you must sign up in enlisted reserve. I don't know whether that was because of the span of time from acceptance, and I still wasn't on the rolls. I had to go and was sworn into the enlisted reserve, but still told, not given any assignment, stay home until you get your letter. And I got the letter in October saying report down to Tuskegee, Alabama in November. So on the 17th of October I got the letter, and within a month I was on my way down to Tuskegee and to enter into the program. And this turned out to be a dual program. In other words, you were trained to be a pilot, but you also trained, in other words, received officer training, because we received commissions as second lieutenants and got our silver wings once you completed the program. So it was, I went down to Tuskegee in November of '42. So I had really kind of waited from April till that time, which turns out to be part of the input, because as we look at the story now, we found that the Army didn't think the program initially was going to be successful, because they didn't believe blacks could really fly and end up in the combat side. And as those classes that had started just ahead of me early in '42 proved we could with the opportunity, well then apparently they increased the flow of pilots down. And so I started my pre-flight training in November of '42, and that increase kept coming because I was moved without taking the weeks of upper pre-flight, moved ahead of class. So I only had the introductory pre-flight training.
So you skipped the whole level of training?
I skipped what they called up. You had lower pre-flight. If you got through that, you went to upper pre-flight. Then you started the primary flying training. And I guess as they increased the numbers in the classes, because like the very first classes were like maybe a dozen cadets as they trained the 99th, and then when they approved the additional training of more squadrons, they upped it, and I think there were, well, we had 21 graduates in my class, and probably started out with maybe 32 or something like that. So they really accelerated the program, and I think that was why, I guess, with my academic record, they moved me right on through the upper pre-flight. And so I ended up then receiving my commission and wings in June of '43 as a member of Class 43F. I originally would have been in Class 43G, then skipping. But
I understand from what you said, I was at the at the program last night.
Oh yes.
That you did have white instructors.
Yes, this was strictly basic and advanced. Now the Army contracted their primary training to civilian pilot, where those schools that had the civilian pilot training program, and Tuskegee Institute happened to be a school that had and received the Army contract to give the primary training in this say black program, if you will. And so we did have black instructors there, but as we moved from there out from Tuskegee Institute out to the air base, we had white instructors. Of course, they were the only ones qualified. There'd been no blacks flying. In the record, he was a captain then, Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., had wanted to fly. In fact, that's the reason he went to West Point back in the 30s and graduated in '36 and applied for flight training, and they wouldn't assign him. This is part of that question you asked me about them having integrated training in ROTC, but as I say, I've never realized that history of the fact that they weren't taking officers and except in certain areas. And of course, he wanted to get in flying. The answer was no, so he did ROTC, and maybe some might probably had a stint with the cavalry at the time and that type of thing. But that was the way that came out at the time.
Did you feel that? Did you feel any antagonism from the white instructors?
I think as I look back on my training, I didn't. I had an instructor, I guess, my primary basic and advanced instructors were maybe not people who were gung-ho for the program and the opportunity for blacks, but maybe had some sympathetic feelings for the situation, and were pretty understanding people. They weren't. I didn't draw any of the instructors that cussed. You get people that, damn it, I said do this. I didn't have that type of person. So my own experience didn't involve that. But I do know there were some who, and this is the nature of some people. Every other word's a cuss word, and with some of my classmates and some of those before me, I know there were problems because that can go on so long, and then it becomes an antagonistic thing, and you get a little hot-headed yourself and make the wrong response and caused it. But directly, I didn't feel that, but I was aware. And then, of course, we were still under the strain that it gives you. And, as a cadet, maybe you're a little removed from it, but we were still in a segregated setup. They were still segregating because although these instructors were with us during the day, or when we went to the dining hall, of course you had one for cadets, but for some of the other black officers that were in the program, and as I had mentioned, my brother going into the service ahead of me, he ended up going through signal school, but the only place they were signing black officers was Tuskegee, so he was down at Tuskegee as a signal officer, not related to the flying program, but really with no mission, because it's the only place they're signing. But people like, here's a segregated dining hall on the base, so the whites went to their dining hall and we went ours, but as a cadet I didn't feel that, but I know from my brother that feeling, because we were both officers, and that separateness that
Well, having grown up in the North, what was it like being in Alabama?
Well, I personally, from all of the things we had heard, the things we've read, and whether it was from, the occasional lynching that took place or the general knowledge of the attitude of particularly folks in Georgia and Alabama toward blacks, you went with a lot of apprehension.
So you kind of knew what to expect, I guess.
Even though part of my schooling was borderline, I had a couple of grade schools that were integrated on a basis, and then some that weren't. But the knowledge of what took place, and that you had to be careful what you did, what you said, were knowledgeable enough that you went with the apprehension and knowing that as you went down, you were maybe one place on the train, and there were, or a segregated car, and you couldn't go to the dining car to eat and that type of thing. We were aware of that, so you were under a bit of strain and concern of what might happen, or what relations, that you're not put in a position that would be confrontive and antagonistic. So you went with that feeling. There's no question.
What kinds of things then did you do in your off hours, or when you had a weekend off or something like this? Did you go into town, or?
Some did. I chose myself, and right after, and maybe another thing happened that made my experience a little different, was that I had met with my wife, current wife, while in school, and after just at time of entering the program, we decided to get married, and she was able to travel down to Tuskegee and work. In fact, she worked as a secretary to Dr. Kenny at the Tuskegee Institute through the week, and on the only time we had together were the few open post hours that you had on Saturday afternoon, and again on Sunday if you didn't have any tours to walk Sunday morning or something like that. So I was, the free time that I had, where perhaps had I been single, would have been going to town. And when you say to town, it would not have been Tuskegee, Alabama. It would have been what we called the block of Tuskegee Institute, or those that could afford and had enough time maybe to get up to Atlanta, because the attitudes of the community of Tuskegee, Alabama, were very antagonistic
Toward the black cadets being there?
Being there, and the black, so, and you had to go through Tuskegee, from Tuskegee Institute. So there was a back road that wasn't often used because of conditions, but so the normal travel route from Tuskegee Institute out to the airfield was through Tuskegee, Alabama, and can't remember that city policeman, Pat something was the policeman's name. There were many incidents of just, in fact, I can remember one time going through town and I was pulled over for a ticket, and I'm in the center car of a group of 3 other cars. In fact, and you got to go up to, and I guess I was braver than I should have been, but appearing before it, because it's one of these things, you're given a ticket, go immediately up, the magistrate's waiting for you. Go up, and I just said the circumstance that I don't understand, that I'm in the middle car of 4 cars proceeding from, I don't know, it was a stop section or a light, I don't recall, but saying, I don't understand what I could have done when I'm in the middle car and get pulled out and given a ticket for whatever, and I can just remember the judge saying, "Well, you be more careful now and just go on," and didn't fine you. Didn't fine me or do anything. Could very well, but there were incidents later, and this relates to the first commander, Tuskegee Army Airfield. And of course, they brought in a white commander out there because there were no blacks really qualified in that area and so on. And I'm trying to see if the name would float back to me right now. But anyway, he was, if you will, was not sympathetic to the cause of the training and so on. And he was more interested in keeping good relations with the community of Tuskegee, Alabama. And of course, they were concerned at one time, and the way he wanted to operate was the military police that guarded the base, fine, but if they were not to go off of the base or carry in there. I think at even one time he dictated they couldn't even carry arms because there was almost an incident where between the black MPs could not bear arms, and yet that was part of their mission. An incident came up. Apparently, somebody had been arrested on the road out to the base, and the blacks with them didn't think it was right, and there was a confrontation between the local police and the base that could have, destroyed the whole program type of thing. But it was, fortunately, that was resolved, but primarily because this first commander that came in was replaced very shortly. He wasn't there too long, and then Colonel Noel Parrish was brought in to command, and I guess the difference was that Parrish believed in the program. In other words, that blacks would be successful.
He was white.
Right, yes, white. Would be successful in the program if given the opportunity, given the training, and so his rapport on base changed the mood and the atmosphere, and at the same time, although he knew he couldn't change the attitudes of the townspeople, he was able to work with them in a way that made relationships a lot smoother.
Now, would his immediate subordinates in the chain of command at the post, were they black?
No, they
were all white.
All white. Now, in some cases, they may have, say they have an administrative officer. As the black non-flying personnel came out of training or were assigned there, they may have them working side by side, but the authority was with the white officer.
But you did have black officers on.
Beginning slowly, right, build up. In other words, in administration and supply and so on, there were some black officers. Some of the first officers came also trained up at Chanute. I think they trained 2 engineers, 2 communicators, 2 in armament or munitions, and they were assigned, and from the sources, and say the signal people coming out of, they were trained at, the signal was Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. They were brought in, but so there was kind of a dual relationship, but if, say again, with the eating and the sleeping, it's still going a separate way. So, and then even if as time some very well qualified blacks came in, say in administration, they still weren't given the senior spot. It was still kind of a subordinate relationship.
But the second commander was was much more congenial and
Parish
yeah.
began to change that type of thing around, and I have never looked into the span of time that slowly that administrative side began to change more to the black officers and on. But the flying side, well, it eventually changed too, but it wasn't until both members of the 99th and then later members of the 332nd coming back as combat returnees. Again, the only place to assign the active duty was Tuskegee, and we did have the opportunity then to become instructors, and many of us replaced the white instructors that had taught us, so that, and of course there were promotions overseas and along the way, and we came back and fit in the structure. Fortunately for my own experience, rather than being single engine, I went into twin engine instruction, which expanded my own flying background. But about the time when the school closed in late '45, after the war ended and all, most of the white instructors had been replaced by black instructors, and most of the base administration turned over. Of course, by then you have some more senior officers as well, majors, maybe a lieutenant colonel or two, where at the beginning of the program, the senior black officer was a captain, that type of thing.
So as far as your contacts with the white folks in that area, you just pretty much avoided the town.
You avoided the town. The night activity would be restricted to Tuskegee Institute, and they had a little nightclub, and there were folks, places.
Where did your wife stay?
Lived with the family.
Live with the family in town or in the
in the area of Tuskegee Institute,
okay.
not Tuskegee itself. Tuskegee Institute sits right adjacent to Tuskegee, and if you will, kind of had its own area. And the town was there, but they were next to each other, but that's us. Yeah. And you even avoided going into town to buy anything unless it was just absolutely necessary.
Did you have full PX facilities on?
No, very limited, very limited. In fact, when the first members of the 99th, when they finished training this ground element at Chanute, they hadn't finished the airfield, and they came down, they bivouacked them over at Maxwell Field in Montgomery. They wouldn't even let them go in the BX. They ended up having a little separate building over there, with just a few supplies.
Everything was segregated.
Completely, yeah. Over on the other side of the field. You couldn't even go in the same chapel. They'd end up with another little chapel. And of course, out there at Tuskegee, we had the chapel and so on, and a small BX, but certainly not provisions like the BX over Maxwell, but we didn't go there. No, we did do more spending of money going into Montgomery, where there was a large black community, and then even at that time, some of the white businesses, $1 is $1. And I can remember when I came back as an instructor, our first, and they had developed a little community of bungalows, again, a part of Tuskegee Institute, and that's where my family and several that came back in the instructing lived, and went over to, I'll always remember the name, Frank Tennille Furniture Company, and they treated us just as I bought my first living room furniture. But that was strictly a relationship, going in, making the selection, taking her money, and they delivered it, that type of thing. But the going and coming, you were even careful where you went in to buy gas, because you were always afraid of hitting a place, and I guess the terminology then, and sometimes still is, if you run into just an old redneck, you don't know what might happen. He just might not like the way you got out of the car, or ask, I'd like to buy some gas. So you were under apprehension.
Did you have to learn, when you went down, did you have to learn a particular way of talking or addressing people, or that you had not been used to in the North?
Well, rather than do that, my own approach was more avoid
all contact.
And not try to change. And when I did, I just tried to be respectful. Talk. I didn't try to change to fit the environment. You just tried to avoid the contacts. And even a number of years later, after I had left Tuskegee and gone over to the Philippines and came back to Maxwell Field, and this is 1953. I was assigned to go through the command and staff school. And although the school now at Maxwell is integrated, I needed a haircut and went in the barber shop one day where everybody was going. The man put the apron on, got his clippers, and started cutting my hair. And then he leaned over and said, "Are you a Negro?" I said, "Well, yes." And he said, "I can't cut your hair." And I had to leave that barber shop. So we tried to get the commander and so forth there at the school to do something about it. So if he's a professional, he should be able to cut anybody's hair. They wouldn't do it. They ended up making arrangements for a black barber in town to come out and found a little room off in another building somewhere where we could go to get our hair cut. Now, this time we could walk in the BX and use the facilities, but there were still those types of things right there on base. We said, if that barber, you're bringing him out of town and he's serving the post here, why are you, the base, why are you letting him, do
refuse.
that? But it took a few more years before that went away. And at that same time, we found a home in the black community of Montgomery to live, because they weren't allowing blacks on base as far as, there was limited housing anyway, but as a student. And one of the biggest things my wife and I had to explain to our daughter, we lived about a block from a city park, but we couldn't use that park. And to tell our growing daughter then, kid that isn't even 10 years old yet, why they couldn't walk and play in the park. And of course, that was the day as you traveled, you still had the separate drinking fountains. But I mentioned the stores began to change, and it was the same in Atlanta. You could go up there, and there were some stores willing to take your money. They still had the separate fountains. And they were beginning to let the wife try on a hat. Some places had a piece of cloth you had to put on first, or things like that. But it was very slowly beginning to change. But gave you always the caution, so you avoided many. And of course, as we traveled, we were dealing with the fact that you had to be prepared to be turned down, and we'd still go, the motel signs flashing vacancy, but you'd go and ask for a room, and you might try 4 or 5 before, or end up having to say, well, we'll just have to keep on driving, and drive many more miles before you finally found. And even then, I can remember a place like Albuquerque, New Mexico, and you'd say, well, you won't put me in, is there anybody? And, well, you go down the street and find, and once in a while you'd find one pretty dirty and run down, almost nobody there, and they'd let take somebody in, so you put up with it, and so that you could get a little rest and go on down the road without falling asleep and killing yourself.
Are there any things about your training period that really sticks in your mind?
Yes, I guess, there were a couple of things. I guess one is kind of based on just being introduced into flying, and I could remember being taken up, and as say our primary field was there, a field right adjacent to Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, this field that belonged to Tuskegee Institute for our primary flying, and being taken up, and they said, well, you can see out there the airfield. They were still building the field and completing all of it. The runways were in, but a lot of the finishing up even when I started my primary training. And I think I said yes, but I'm not sure what I saw at the time. And of course, it got by that, and then. Again, talking to the instructor, as I said, I had an instructor who was a very genial person and so on, and as I was about to complete my advanced training and getting through the course, he said, I think you'd make a good twin-engine pilot, a multi-engine pilot. I said, sure wish that opportunity was open to you. And I said, well, I don't know exactly what my words were, but It was interesting because by the time I'd gone overseas and come back, they'd authorized the twin engine training program, but that wasn't even available in June of '43.
When were you given your commission, your wings?
June 30th of 1943.
What was your first assignment?
And to the 302nd Squadron. And of course, this is one of the things that made our program, I guess, in experience different than any others. Normally, you would go to one location that did primary training. You'd have classmates there, and then there'd be more than one basic school. The white pilots would be sent to any one of 2 or 3 basic schools, and the same from their advanced. So they had different people. All of our training was one place. So we went from that primary training at Moulton Field, right adjacent to Tuskegee Institute, to the air base. So you went through primary together. You went, pre-flight together. You went through primary together. You moved out to the base and went through basic together. No place to go because it's right here. Went through advanced together and got commissioned. So once you entered the program till you graduated, we're together like this. Everything. Where everybody else was, new friends, maybe 2 or 3. A couple maybe only 2 out of the whole class would go all the way through, each going to the same place, and even then they may be split up, one sent this way and one the other. We not only went through all the training together, we're all poured into the same pool for first 33 for the 99th, the next groups into the 332nd, which was 3 more squadrons, the 100, 301st, 302nd. Went through all our combat training together. Instead of being assigned to units, we're going to take the whole unit, keep it segregated, and take it overseas together. Came home, back to the same thing. When they closed the training, and those of us wanting to stay on, of course, some opted to get out immediately. Others that may have wanted to but weren't selected to stay on because they were given regular Army exams at the time. In fact, I took it and never did pass it, but they kept me on then. Much later, I was offered a commission without any further testing. So we were all together, and perhaps it did give our unit something that helped us in our combat and improving ourselves, because we knew each other. We could recognize who was down the ramp just from the way they walked and carried. Never see their face because we just knew each other that well. So we did have a camaraderie and a togetherness that probably is unique, and it makes it interesting because in that initial experiment and so on, they just didn't expect the program to be successful, but it was all out of myths and fallacies,
stereotypes.
Right,
Sure.
And stereotypes, and had nothing to do with the training and opportunity. So this, as we finished our training, got our wings, in other words, our instructional training, we then went into combat training using the P-40, and as Tuskegee became overcrowded, they opened Selfridge Field, Michigan, for the buildup of the 332nd Fire Group. Now, the 99th completed their training and was sent overseas in '43 as a separate squadron attached to white groups. Then the other 3 squadrons were all doing their combat training and filling up the organization up at Selfridge Field, and we did our gunnery work up at Oscoda Air Base off of the lake up north of in Michigan, where we could have gunnery out over the lake, but Selfridge was our main base and organizing base for the training, and flying the P-40. So from June through December of '43 was the development and the combat training of the 332nd Fighter Group, and I mentioned Captain Davis being in that first class. He was brought in to command the 99th. Well, another thing that shows you what was going on, he went through training as a captain. When they finished training the 99th and looked, and of course he was made the commander, but they looked at the record, and normally graduates of West Point pretty much move along together in their promotions. He was a captain. Found out all of his classmates were lieutenant colonels. So he was given a paper one day promotion through major to lieutenant colonel to be equal with his other classmates. And so he took the 90, he was commander of the 99th as a lieutenant colonel, taking them to North Africa attached to a white group. And that's another story because the group didn't really want them. But then he had come home in the fall, or I guess the August or September of 43. He turned the 99th over to then Major Roberts, Spanky Roberts, and he came back to take command of the 332nd Group as they were formed and to take them into combat. So Colonel Davis then took the whole group, the other three squadrons, overseas. We left Michigan in December of 43 and down to Patrick Henry, and they had the convoys that took us over, and we landed in Italy in 1944. But in our training, they had decided when we got overseas we would have the P-39, so we not only had combat training in the P-40, we continued and retransitioned into the P-39.
That was the Air Cobra, wasn't it?
Air Cobra, right, with the engine behind.
Yeah, and the little duck that stuck up like that behind the cockpit.
Right,
Yeah.
That's good. So we had that dual training and received P-39, so the 99th initiation into combat in all of the first 6 months of 43 and on into 44 was flying the P-40. The 332nd never flew the P-40 in combat. We flew P-39s, and we were all assigned to the 12th Tactical Air Force. And in mid-year of 44, we had pushed the Germans far enough north that we had. Do you have to turn? Okay. We had pushed the Germans far enough north that they could begin to put the bombers on Italian soil and give them better range to get to the Ploesti oil fields and Regensburg, Germany chemical plants, and hit the German war-making potential. And there was a need to increase the fighter escort then for them going that deep into the Balkans and into Germany, and so and even into southern France going the other way. So the 332nd fighter group was one of either 4, and there must have been 5 fighter groups picked to do escort work. So even overseas, we're operating as a separate group, and say we even had our own rest camp because we didn't want to combine the rest camp over there. Now the 99th's attached to white groups, but still faced with the same thing. They couldn't go to the rest camps where the whites went and this type of thing.
Where were you stationed when you were in Italy?
We were stationed just south of Naples, and you built tent cities. They find a good level area and lay pier steel planking, they called it, runways, and you operated from there. Now I think the 99th, as they moved up, may have had an occasion or two. I think when they went into Sicily, they did occupy an airfield that the Italians had, with the Germans and that when they were pushed out. But by and large, you just built tent cities and runway. Shortly after we had been in the work, we went to Capodichino Airport at Naples, and that's just a big grass, real wide area, a grass strip, and we pitched our tents. You had right off of the landing area, you parked your aircraft and built the tents behind them, and so you lived right there, and of course they'd have a mess tent and that type of thing. So in those early years, it was like being in the field. You were in the field for sure. And as time went on, we learned to take the old oil drums and get us a piece of copper tubing and make a line to have a nice furnace, and that was one of the fun things there, because every now and then you'd hear this big poof, and you could run outside and see whose tent the soot was floating away from, and you knew who had probably, if his fire went out, and because the heat would introduce some more fuel and didn't light it soon enough, but had a lot of fumes there, and when he did light it, and we may have burnt down a tent or two, I didn't, but we learned to build up the floor with, find scrap wood as materials were shipped in, and take the crates from our drop tanks that brought in for the planes, and make yourself pretty comfortable. make little war stands, still washed out of your helmet and shaved out of your helmet, but, you know, make yourself a little war stand to put it in instead of squatting down on the ground. And you improvised a lot as you came along. But then we moved, let's say, from Cappadoquino, we were still flying the P-39, but when they needed this escort, the 332nd was one of the groups picked to move over to the Adriatic side. That cut off a few miles still to go north across the Adriatic into the Balkans to do that escort. And we first were given then the P-47. And the P-47 was good, had the 6 pair of guns, so I mean, it really 8.
Longer range?
More than, of course, the P-39 was a low altitude aircraft, very slow, so it wouldn't have fit in the escort mission at all, because you couldn't have done it. In fact, we gave the P-39s to the Russians, who used them for the ground support, and was very effectively against the Germans. We had the P-47, and it had the supercharger. Now we changed our mission then from tactical to the strategic escort in their superiority role. The P-47 had a supercharger that cut in about 19,000 feet, and it gave you another boost up to 28 or so thousand feet, which was pretty effective, but it got pretty sluggish up there. It was a big, the big nose big prop up there, and all. And was a good aircraft for escorting the B-24 boxcars, because their general altitude was like 22,000 feet, and a few of them could get a little higher. They were trimmed.
So you could get above them.
We preferred to be 2,000-3,000 feet above them, and so for the B-17s that wasn't so good, because some of those B-17s are trimmer aircraft and with good engines in them, and I've seen B-17s at 30,000 feet. So we wanted to be above them, but so fortunately we received P-51. After about 6 weeks, the P-51s were beginning to be shipped over that were coming out of the factories, and that just turned out to be, I still wear it.
I noticed that.
P-51 proudly, because I think for its day and time, it was like something being way ahead of its time, just really a fighter pilot's dream. And to me, it was very maneuverable from the ground to 35,000 feet, so we could more effectively escort the B-17s that could get up to 30. And although they followed their bomb leader, the higher they could get, that got them up out of that, because the Germans knew where they were flying, and the basic level was just saturated like a blanket with flak, and so anyone that could trim up and get a little higher, they would. And of course, we wanted to always be above the highest one, and so we really found the 51 an ideal.
Is it difficult going from one plane to another?
I didn't find it that way. You know, one of the things that I still say about the early flying, it's amazing, and you can't do it in today's aircraft because of the sophistication and so on. And we used to laugh and say, well, if there's an aircraft out there, if the crew chief can start it, I can fly it. Even if you didn't know how to start it, you could get in and fly the aircraft. So the training was excellent, and it wasn't done to some different standard. In other words, it was a standard, and I think that's one of the things that's made our Air Force a super one, that we've had excellent training and I guess excellent products to get into.
But what did they do? Did they just say, here's a P-51, fly it? I mean,
even in that day, you had what you called a tech order that went through the systems. In other words, your fuel system, oil system, the engines and how things made up, and then they had a questionnaire. So you had to review your technical instructions and take the exam. In other words, to know what the oil pressure ranges were and what's critical to know fuel and how you transferred if you had that capability. And so there were some just basic things that you had to learn. Then you'd go out and sit in the cockpit, look around, learn here's the flap switch, here's your engine instruments, here's your little navigation group, and get familiar. In fact, we'd even take and put a blindfold on, so you'd say, where's the oil pressure gauge? Right here. Where's your horizon? It's right here. Where's your land? Your gear? Oh, it's here. Where's your camera switch? Take a say right here. That. So you went through that type of thing. Then you got in. You might have been a little shaky first ride or so on, but you just went through aircraft. And as I say, for many years, that idea that once you've been basically trained, you could get in anything and fly it. That's pretty much the deal.
I talked with a pilot here recently. He went from, a couple of years ago, he went from 47s to 51s. And, he said numbers of people he knew had trouble with the 51s because they were so powerful. That there was so much torque. They weren't in the 51s, or hadn't been in earlier planes, that some people cracked up because they didn't.
Yeah, I think that here and there did happen. I think having come through the P-40, which had an awful lot of torque when you went in, if I recall, it was about a 1,400 horsepower engine. You could almost master anything, but there was a difference. Say, sitting in the jug, you got that big radial engine in front of you, and although the horsepower of them wasn't that much different, I don't remember there was more than maybe 50 or so, 75 horsepower difference in the engine. That big radial wound up a little bit differently when you gave it power than the little more sleeker 51 with its inline engine and a little tighter cockpit. So I think there may be multiple things that affected people. Some feeling real comfortable in that big wide cockpit of the P-47 felt a little cramped and so on in the 51. Looking out over that long nose was a little different, but both of them were tail low aircraft, so you had the S on the ground to really see, you didn't just taxi straight ahead. You had to, we called it S-ing, but, do the turns on the ground, weaving turns to see where you were going. I personally found the 51 to me, without coolant, was no different than a P-47 if it ran out of oil. They both had their problems. The engine is going to run but so long if you lose either one. But I think just from the sheer controllability of the 51, and in fact that it was an aircraft much more easily trimmed, didn't have the nose having. That's another thing the P-47 had. As you picked up speed, it had a tendency for that big nose and prop to want to tuck under, and you didn't have that in the 51, so it was just a little bit different.
Well, that was obviously your favorite plane of all time.
That's what I say. So it became my favorite because of I looking at it now, probably little things like that just made it so.
Tell me about your missions, the ones that you went on personally. You were escorting almost all the time?
Yeah, as I say, our early missions with the P-39 were harbor and coastal patrol, and there we found
you just kind of flew around.
You had with the Naples harbor was kind of enclosed harbor, so you'd go out to the mouth of the harbor and patrol at a certain altitude, observing whatever was going on. But it was, again, an underpowered aircraft for weight and mission, and although they occasionally are radar, people would say they had something flying at 7. Normally we might patrol at 10 or 12,000 feet and say, well, I got something going by at 17. You could climb in that thing. The time you could get to 17 from 12, he's long gone. It was just too slow, and even though it had the cannon in the nose, it didn't, unless you can, if you can't get somebody, that didn't mean much. And our missions were around the clock, dawn to dusk, and the occasional night missions. But most of that patrol work was a daytime more than night. Going into the escort missions gave a difference. Pretty much in the patrol work, we operated as an element, maybe sometimes a flight of floor. So it was continuous work, but as you were relieved on station and came in when after you'd been out an hour plus and came back to refuel and get rest, and somebody else went out. When we went to the escort mission, now we became a squadron and a group effort. So each squadron would put up 16 aircraft and 2 spares when the whole group was flying. So you've got 3 squadrons with 18 aircraft taking off. Very interesting operation, because here we just have one strip, and as I say, back off the strip we had our parking revetment, behind that our tents. They did take over an old farmhouse for the operations area and briefing area, and perhaps an area where the commander, Colonel Davis, stayed, but the rest of those, the tent city development. But in order to get the squadron off and get formed up in time to make a rendezvous, and this is something else that happened at the time we went into this escort work in mid-June of, late June of 44, and moving to this strategic mission. They moved the 99th to the same strip. So all 4 black squadrons did the escort work together. In other words, they no longer assigned the 99th to a white group, they assigned them to the 332nd. So from June of 44 on, right as we finished, I think a few of the 99th got transitioned in the P-47 before we got to 51s, but I don't even know that any of them flew combat. We flew several combat missions, I'd say, for about 6 weeks. When they came to us, they started transition, but then we got to 51, so all of us flew 51s and the rest of the war. So this gave us, in order to get the group off in a timely manner, we would all, on the morning flying, taxi out, 2 squadrons going to this end of the runway, the other 2 going down here. And the first squadron off, they would fly whatever direction, and I almost didn't care what the wind was. Normally I like to fly into the wind, but we'd do it when the ones at this end got off, the ones at the other end would start and go. And if you aborted, you just have to go down there and sit at the end of the runway until all the squadron's off and you got a chance to clear off out of the way. And then we would form up first, in their flights, and then the flight so that you'd be stacked down 4-4 till you had your 16 in line, and then that squadron would meet up with the other, and you'd climb on to your rendezvous point with the bombers, pick up the bomber stream, and go in above them and take them on into the target and out. One of the things our group was, if there were any bombers hit on their bomb run or began to straggle, we'd always dispatch an element or 2 to stay with them and protect them until they got back far enough out of the danger area to be able to go on back. And that, as we look back through the history, turned out to be one of the credits to the group. That, and I think I mentioned earlier that a lot of the bomber pilots did not know that it was black pilots flying, but they knew our aircraft identification, the red tail, and we've had many a heartwarming story of pilots who are saying thanks now for something that took place.
I had one of them. I talked to one of them.
Yeah, and all he knew was a red tail. He didn't know that.
He found out later.
Later, yes.
Yeah,
In fact, in many of their reunions now, and folks have come, and even last year over at Oshkosh, I had a man come who said that his father related the story of an incident of being protected, and he didn't know it was black pilots, but he knew it was a red tail, and related, that his things from the story that his father had passed on to him.
Was it unusual for the fighter planes to escort bombers over the target?
No, we generally...
No, I mean, was that peculiar to the black units, or
no,
was this...
Well, let me see, to answer that truthfully. I think there are 2 elements that come into that. On extremely long missions, you could have been assigned to take the bombers into the target and were to be relieved. Somebody else would take them over the target, and then maybe even in case of somebody picked them up for protection coming out. Then there were other missions where you would be assigned to stay with that group throughout the whole mission, so it varied. Another element comes in here, and this is from my experience not only in Europe, but my experience in Korea. And I think it's like anything. All of the glamour and the glory goes to, say, being an ace. And there were known cases, and I think we have to be honest and say so, that there were cases of escort people hearing that there were enemy aircraft in the area would leave their bombers to go find out where they are so they could get some kills. That had its impact, I think, on what we're talking about. One of the things I can recall then, Colonel Davis, being the disciplinarian he is, and I believe it was right. If your mission is to protect those bombers, if they're not attacked, you don't go off looking.
Don't be a hot dog. Huh?
That's right. You stay there and do that job. And he was in, as the later rightfully insisted that be the task, and I think that's why, as the story is developed, it's felt and pretty much seems to be true that the Red Tails have been credited with never losing a bomber that they had under escort to an enemy fighter. It was because of that staying there with that mission and doing whatever it could take as long as you could possibly stay with the fuel and so on.
Did you encounter quite a few fighters when you were escorting?
It was spasmodic. Actually, our role was twofold. We had some missions when we weren't needed either for bomber escort or weather might keep the bombers from getting off, where we were given a mission, just what we call the fighter sweep, to go out and attack the field, catch aircraft on the ground. We had several of those and destroyed a lot of aircraft, ground transportation, locomotives and vehicles on the ground. And then in the escort missions, the effect by that time, in other words, in late 44 and early 45, with once the attack into France and so on, the concentration of Germans, and then I guess some of their own decisions on where they would mount efforts. You could go up one day and never see a fighter. Next day the sky might be full of them. So there was no consistency, and I think some of the analysts say sometimes it was because of bad command decisions, other times because of just the distribution of fuel. In other words, we were taking a toll as they attacked the oil fields and so on the distribution of supplies and catching these the trucking and trains disturbing the distribution of fuel. How much effect it would take, and again, the analysts to look at it all that had. So there were days you might go 2 or 3 days, and one day you might only see one flight, very few. Another time they would have mounted a bigger effort. So we had days that were several scraps and days with nothing. Just completed the mission and came back. Again, I guess when you're there doing the job, few of us thought about analyzing and looking at this and what that means. The effect, you just one today, get your rest, go off 3 days rest and come back gung-ho to go and get in a few more missions. And so I only got in, I think it was in late August or early September, in one big fight where there were a lot of there, and I shot down one 109 scrap, following him down, because you start out, once you pick them up, you end up down, even down, sometimes down the ground. We were down at ground level over the airfield that had been attacked by the bombers by the time I got him.
So you were escorting a bomber?
We were escorting a bomber, and they attacked, and flights were dispatched as they came in to keep them off of the bombers.
How did you feel about that experience?
Well, it's being a fighter pilot, knowing that that's your prime mission. If it gets to that point, it's rather exhilarating to know that you had everything working. You got the gun camera on, switching on and everything, and were able to get on his tail instead of him on yours, and that your wingman or something had kept that from happening, however it turned out. And I guess you just, in my own case, you look at it as having accomplished the mission. You don't think about, boy, I really killed that guy, which, that
Sure.
doesn't enter into your mind. The fact that you said, well, that's one more that won't be mounted against future attacks.
Was it a several-minute engagement, or did these things happen pretty rapidly?
Well, the chase, and really, I guess when you say several minutes, it ends up, if you really put the stopwatch on it, it would probably matter of no more than probably a couple of minutes, a minute and so many seconds, because you're maneuvering. In other words, they come in at an angle at great speed and hopefully make a pass and get down, and once you get them, so it all happens really pretty fast.
You don't have time to get scared?
You don't have time to get scared. You're more apprehensive to getting your switches on, and then getting them in your sights and maneuvering and still hoping and twisting around a bit to look and be sure somebody isn't on you, and getting that angle where you can get in a shot and fire on them. So, and then it's all over this that quick. Things are quiet, you know, and you get away and you no longer see the smoke and the fires on the ground. You're back into climbing back to altitude and picking up, if you can, the rest of the flight and heading on back home. And so it's something that's kind of over in a flash. You either done the job. I think only one other time that there was a strike, my element was not dispatched, and sometimes you chase them away and folks didn't get a chance to fire, and you know they talk about that. I wish I got in there, but it's just the way it happened, and it does. It's the way the operation there from that area of Italy went. It was all over pretty quick, and I don't know whether the pilots who flying just because of rain from the airfields and the fact that fighters could maybe, because they didn't have as far to go, folks flying out of 8th Air Force and flying out of England might have been attacked a lot more and a longer distance out from, after they'd gone over targets and back and were under attack frequently, both the fighters or the bombers, because of where the German airfields were. In other words, they'd be hit going in and hit over the target and somebody else hit them out. The deployment of the German Air Force was spread out a lot farther, and that may have been a factor of why flying from the underbelly of Europe that we didn't have constant daily.
Mm-hmm. Did you escort bombers over Ploesti, or?
The longest mission I've flown, P-51, 6.5 hours. Was going with bombers into Ploesti oil field, staying with them, coming out. It was almost the same. We had a few flights before they got all of the Germans out of Greece. We even had a few flights over that direction, and they were 6 hour and 15, 20 minutes.
Each way or one way?
That's round trip.
Round trip.
But a long time to sit in that little cockpit.
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you do if you have to go to the bathroom?
You find where you tell the fellas, don't worry about we wiggling around over here. You pull out off to the side of the formation, and they had a little tube there, but you get your stick, and it's hard to get because you had your flight suit on and your Mae West, and of course sitting on your with parachute. We had gotten a hold of some British equipment, and I flew most of my tours using a British parachute because I found it a lot more comfortable. The way the pack and all was made, but sometimes you had to fight hard to get out. So you're sitting out there trying to hold the stick against one knee or hand and do it, and you wiggle around and then come back in, waggle your wings, say everything's okay, and go on. And it's rather interesting.
What was your scariest experience? Of course, maybe you don't have time to be scared. You said before.
Now, one interesting, we had a low altitude mission to hit some radar sites on the southern border of France to, I guess, a suppression mission, if you will, before some bombers came in to bomb that particular area. And we're coming in off the coast in our firing pattern to fire at the sites, and before we get within range, it just looked like that whole coastline was puffing away. The bombers had gotten there early, and were already dropping the bombs as we were coming in, and that got a little interesting because we had to break out of that.
So you were in danger from the flak too?
But not only from the flak, but that we might fly right on in under and get from the either the bombs dropping or exploding, depending on what they were dropping, getting damaged by our own, and that became rather interesting. You say, how do I get out of this situation? But quick. I think the only other that came close to the flying I did there was there were a couple of cases in one of these strafing missions that you had to be careful of getting over eager and flying through your own debris because you never knew what you'd hit. We'd have cases of hitting a truck or a train and finding out there was ammo And when that goes up, you get that burst up pretty high in the air, and we have had air folks. Fortunately, I didn't damage an aircraft myself, came close a couple of times, but folks coming back and found out that flying through the debris you've just caused can be pretty dangerous.
I always thought that strafing would be kind of an exhilarating thing to do.
Well, it is, because it's, and in that early training, we trained, I think, much better and much more realistic now, but the ability to, like we trained, you had the big square target set up there and you flew, but here, some cases you were on a moving target, sometimes sitting, but to be able to see there and see the concentration of your power, and then the way guns were bore-sighted to, and I think one of the other things you feel that you'd always arrive right at that firing point where that focal was right on target, where your pattern merged, and you could just see the results of it. So it did have that exhilarating part. And then there was in that particular type of mission, there was a little more freedom, because you were just worried that there weren't other aircraft in the air, but you didn't have that protected mission, and so you felt a little freer, and it was more like targets of opportunity rather than, and that gives you...
So shooting from the hip, kind of.
Right, yeah, whatever you see, go get it, type of which, in other words, well, I guess war is not fun, but what you'd call a fun type mission.
Did you have much contact with civilians when you were overseas?
Not at the locations where we were. Our contact came when we went back to Naples to the rest camp. And they had a dual program for rest. Often you could take a 3-day type of thing, and then they had a period after another length of time that you might, I guess the most was a 7-day, and there was some chance maybe to get to a place like Rome once they got the front line up north of there. And our contact was very cordial and always good. The biggest problem we had was still those whites over there who were in the same area. We've had folks come up and say, if you were back in the States, you wouldn't be eating in here. And a couple of cases where guys that didn't care got together with you. I didn't get into any scraps, but 2 or 3 would come back and reported, they turned that tavern out because the blacks are in with a couple of pilots they'd gotten to know. And there were cases as time went on that some of the bomber pilots began to know some of the pilots that may have met up, particularly in Rome area, not where we had the separate rest camps back in the Naples area. And somebody else say, well, if you were back in the States, you would be drinking beer in here. And the guy would say, well, let's turn this place out. End up with a big fracas, and weren't too many of those, but it did happen. And some tried to spread still the rumor type thing, trying to tell the Italian people, don't deal with blacks, but the color rubs off, or they're like monkeys, they have tails and all this. But most folks didn't buy that and treated you very broad. And I think it was the same. Sometimes folks ask how we did have some men shot down who became prisoners of war, and how were they treated? And I think you could only say there that even though the Germans were fighting the war, they respected another professional, if you will, for their ability and so on. And the black prisoners were treated just like any other prisoner. There's no joy in the prison camp, but they were not separated out and given any worse treatment. They were respected for...
Did you lose any friends during the war?
I did. Probably the closest I mentioned that touched me more than just losing somebody that I knew, or somebody in one of the other squadrons whom I had gotten to know. I mentioned that we had this takeoff pattern, and if somebody's airplane had to board, they had to wait till the others got off. One of the things about the inline engine, even with all of the work of our mechanics, a very vulnerable engine after several days of rain, to have that magneto cleared and warmed up and operating in a way that didn't give me trouble. And in spite of the fine work of our mechanics, many times I can remember, this was on my wingman's 98th mission, and the way it was calculated, on the mission count, it was his 98th mission, and we had several days of rain, and finally the weather was clearing, and it was a group operation, and when our turn came to take off, we took off, and of course he had to abort and went down the end of, taxied on down the end of the runway waiting. A little later, before all of the squadrons off, was another man had to abort, and we were on, the farmer had let his sheep wander onto the runway, and the second man that ran into the flock of sheep on the side of the runway where he was, and it veered him into my wingman sitting there waiting, and that prop just ran up the side of the fuselage and killed it. Of course, I didn't know this till I got back from the mission. I just knew he had aborted, and we went on, and the rest joined up, and one of the spares took his spot. And that gets pretty close to him.
Sure
and also knowing that he didn't have that much farther to go to have been able to come home like the rest of us did, leaves you with a kind of heavy feeling. And of course, any of the losses, though, you felt them in a way, but you pick up and carry on. And I found that same thing happen in Korea, but with the mission being the utmost, I guess you just find that inner strength to keep on going and realize that you can't give up because of losses. It's part of it.
Did you and your comrades, in view of the treatment in the United States, ever talk about why it was you were doing this? In other words, you're rejected at home, and yet you're here, risking your life. Why you're doing it?
There wasn't a great lot of talk in the 302nd Squadron. I'll have to say that because that was the squadron I was in, and so on. I think there was, I attribute it to, and maybe a part of my own feeling of being very optimistic that perhaps performance at some time or other will override this thing of people with images and this that weren't right, and maybe it was also an inner desire that others would see me and respect me for what I do, not what I look like or that type of thing. If I say something bad and you want to treat me something, that's fine. But if I don't, being respectful and asking for respect, and I think that came more as an analyzation as time went on, that there's just got to be a change because this isn't right. That there are those who are still going to put you in a second-class status, even though you have, say in the case of my wingman, given the ultimate, that you could. But it's, as far as setting out to say, well, we're going to prove this or do this, it didn't really quite come out that way. With a concerted effort to say as a group or two, three of us, well, we're going to go do this so that this is the outcome.
Did you feel patriotic?
I feel there was a great respect for the flag, if you will, and the fact that yes, I have accomplished something, and given and perhaps regretted a lot that even as we came back and faced certain incidents, that even if there was still no respect from certain individuals for a person because of skin color, that it also reflected no respect for the uniform and so on. That I think that had its effect on a number of our members, that who felt, well, even if they don't respect me, they oh yeah, they will respect a uniform. In fact, there were a couple of incidents that was almost just the opposite. Just had to know that this person was up to something, because there were no black captains and there were no black pilots wearing wings. So this guy's falsified this situation, and that had its impact. And I guess how much of an impact depended a lot on what your total background was. As I say, mine was from kind of a mix with being in an area where schools weren't segregated, maybe because there were too few blacks, but where the swimming pool and some other things still were to those who went through a different environment where maybe it was all segregated and a lot harsher situations. And I guess in analyzing my own demeanor, I've always been one more optimistic, and that day comes that people will respect you for who you are and what you do, and not how you dress. Comb your hair.
What effect do you think your war service had on you as a person? Did the war have a significant impact on you?
I don't say that the war itself did, other than that point we just mentioned of having been proud to have served and done the job successfully and with a degree of merit. I didn't have, I don't know whether you could say, well, we were caught up with the propaganda that the whole country had, that we had to access might a powerful blow, and we did that, type of thing. I didn't run into really any questions of why we fight and what impact carrying out a mission may have as far as it affects individuals, until getting involved in missions in Korea, where we knew that civilians were forced to carry munitions and do things, and if they crossed a certain line, you had to fire on them. Other than that, that wasn't a place or time for compassion or other thoughts. I think you had to rely and believe that we were being given the truth, that leaflets were dropped, that people were fully informed, and that they would be subject to being attacked if they went into certain areas.
And this was in Korea?
In Korea. Gave us the freedom to feel that we're carrying out a mission. It has its importance in relation to, and may mean, if not carried out, the loss of lives of ground troops that we were affecting. So that had a little different element, and even at the time, it was really more after that you begin to look at it and wonder what's right. I say maybe I rationalize my own mind, but I do feel that we had to have a degree of faith in what we're being told as far as that we were not attacking innocent women and children, and that type of thing.
You had a long military career, many years. Do you have any regrets about having...
You can ask the question.
Yeah, and I guess my question, well, I don't exactly remember what it was. My question involved the transition from a segregated to a non-segregated Air Force, and whether you had any personal problems, difficulties during this time.
I think I would say I did not have any direct conflict or, if you will, insubordination or an officer because of their of his attitudes to confront that. I think more of the problem I did face was those individuals who whether from their own family background or whatever, who still carried their prejudices pretty strong, who behind the scenes would say things, and you knew, but it was something that, I guess the best way I could say it now, that, and particularly when I went back to the Philippines, which was right after Korea, and became a commander of the 44th, was that I would have to let the dignity of the office override my reaction to hearing a derogatory joke by somebody who still thought that was a great thing, to tell off-color jokes, or hear somebody make a comment, whether they intended it or heard it or thought they were making it where I didn't hear it, and to, if you will, just rise above that a level again, perhaps also out of my own commitment that if you want respect, then you have to also be respectful, and maybe that's a way of overcoming some of these attitudes that people carried. And certainly we were well aware that people don't change overnight, and there were many occasions that either I or my wife or the family were faced with those people who still weren't happy with integration and so on. But in my own command functions, I tried to treat people very fairly. I think probably several years later in another command function, I think one of the personally became a rather tough job, because I knew this officer was, like I guess he was saying, hated with his guts the fact that I was a commander, and that the relationships that I had with the men, and in this case we had school teachers and some women and all, and secretaries working in the unit and for our unit, did not like the relationships that togetherness in the unit brought about. But yet to rate that officer, I was also this officer's rating officer, and to rate him fairly for the job he was doing, and not let my knowledge of his prejudice cause me to downrate him in a way that would affect his career. And
did you have any apprehension, in view of your World War II career, did you have any apprehension about the prospect of being placed in command over white men? Did this ever bother you?
It really never did. And even the command assignment came about a way that that wasn't something sought out or so on. I happened to be the senior officer, and the group commander was a person who let the system work. And I guess if I had not performed successfully adequately, I would have been relieved. And I've always had, I guess, and again something I can reflect back on, have enjoyed the opportunity to work with and deal with people, and certainly is one of the things I learned as moving into command, even at that time, was that the work is done by a lot of little people, at night and at times, and that you have to look out for them and so on, and it all worked well for me, and I guess, and I'd always, I guess something else that I learned way back, having had a chance to go through Scouts and the way I was treating myself, was that you can go around with a chip on your shoulder, but if you do, somebody's sure going to knock it off, and you better be prepared to react. And I just, that I guess I was more of the, if you're hit, turn the other cheek before you react, perhaps is a little better way to look at things, and maybe it served me well because of that. I analyzed it.
And I guess perhaps even more possibly serious, did you ever think that you were being treated unfairly by a superior because of racial differences?
I think there may have been a case or two that whether it's a feeling of being overlooked or that treatment should have been there. I guess nothing really overt where it stood out that it was a real affront and something that needed to be called to even higher up, attention of the case. But as I think I have been very fortunate in the type of assignments where I was assigned the people that related to that there was such a minimum of that there was no situation that came up. There was one situation late in my service that came up, and I don't think it had anything to do with my color, but it did affect the chief of maintenance. Was a white officer, a colonel, and I was. I know he was director of materiel for the wing, and I was chief of maintenance. Both of us were colonels on the job, and the particular aircraft that we had to do some tasks with, we were having some supply problems and maintenance problems, and the commanding general demanded that we come down to headquarters and give them a picture of how we were going to get well and so on. And working with the director of materiel and chief of supply, we prepared a statement of the picture and what we were doing and when we thought we could get well. And as the chief of maintenance, I had the responsibility to give the briefing. And when the briefing was over, the general stood up and walked out and said, "I don't believe a word you've said." And this is to the wing commander, the director of materiel, and myself. There were just 6 of us. He had a couple of his staff. I was 6 of us in the room. So I don't believe a word you said, and walked out. We accomplished everything we said we could do, and this was like in March or April, and we said, by 30 June, etc. We never got an apology or anything. We accomplished exactly what. Now, whether that was his own prejudice, and he was the wing commander later, not too long after that, made general, chief of maintenance, our tours ended not too long after, and we both came home. He out of service, I had a little more time to do. A situation like that, you don't know. Was he, whether he was one of these older officers who never did like integration and didn't like the fact that, and I guess if he could have been able to say, "I don't want him briefing me, somebody else do it," or what. But that was almost, like a slap in the face. I've never had a situation with that type of disrespect, if you will, or something. And even though we accomplished the mission and made the improvement we said would take place with what we were doing, and so fortunately that only happened once.
Did your wife have a more difficult time than you?
My wife has never talked about it much, but I think more in after I got out of the service again, I'm attuned to some of the things that
because wives can be pretty hard on each other.
I was going to say, I think she did feel often much more left out or respected more of not respect so much for her, but this, well, there's nothing else we can do, we'll just put up with the situation. Far more, and probably because, and yet along that same way, I don't know of any assignment in place where she was that she did make friends with some people that we're still friends with today. But I do think that there were times that if the choice were hers, well, we would not have made it, remained as a career. But she was very faithful. Didn't bring it up, but there are cases now that, and I know from her attitude, things she said now that she didn't say then, that I'm sure she had some very miserable moments of feeling, just like, why am I here and how could I get out of this situation? Because there's no need to be treated this way.
So from your experience, the integration of the Air Force went smoothly?
I think that would be, I would say that's a fair, not without some, as I say, those cases where we had to walk that thin line because of location of where we were, but the actual, my integration, if you will, into that workforce and the type of assignments, you couldn't write a script that would be any more successful. Well, I think you had asked whether I had it all to do over again, or did I have any regrets on having served and remained in the military. And from a pilot point of view, if you will, and I guess then saying also as a professional military person, no, I don't have any. I think any area that I look at and evaluate it, and would I try maybe to do something a little different, had maybe more to do with family relationships than those personally, and perhaps my dedication to doing the job assigned and so on to the best of my ability and that type of thing. Missed a couple of things that may have taken place in relation to the family.
Kind of a vagabond, aren't you, as a military person?
Right,
Yeah.
and then one that you don't always have insight to that affected one of our children more than the other. That was our youngest daughter. And this is a relationship that I guess is something none of us going into something really see. But in this case, again, being a minority person, and in situations where, as we've gone through the service, there were never a large number of minorities at the same place at the same time. But and then being as I progressed in rank, and I guess the best way to say it was that finally came on the situation when we were in Germany late in the career that and in dealing with some problems our daughter was having, found out that the effect on her was that she wasn't Yvonne, a person and so on, but, oh, you're the colonel's daughter. And her peers treated her differently because of that, and then part of it relates to the association in that seeking to be a friend to the other blacks who were there. Maybe some of them parents were only enlisted, and of course with that non-fraternization rule of the services. So there were some effects on her that maybe we didn't realize in time. So would I not enter the service to resolve that? I don't think so. I think I would still do it, but I would perhaps try to be more attuned to that type of thing happening before it became an effect on the way she acted or reacted to situations. But it has left me with telling other folks that in being able to choose a career, there's probably nothing better in life than to be able to do a good portion of it doing something you thoroughly enjoyed doing. And of course this takes the flying outside of the war situation, but just the flying in general. And I guess it's why there seems to be, wherever you go, a certain camaraderie among people who fly or have an interest in aviation that doesn't relate anywhere else in our community. You can grow up in a community and among people who have an interest in aviation, there just seems to be a type of rapport. Some of it, say, overcomes the racial types of distinctions or so on that happen in other environments in a community, and we've noticed that. And I've noticed it sometimes even from comments that my wife has made, that once getting around a group of people interested in aviation, I guess the best way to say it, her comfort zone increases because of the relationships that common interest overrides a lot of things that take place. Folks, I don't know, I guess the best way to say it, folks don't look at what kind of tie you put on, or what color it is, or wherever your interest is, that you have something common and related to the aviation field.
What happened to you? What did you do between the wars?
The type of assignments, well, there came that time where they said, well, you can't fly all the time and you have to go to tech school and say, I ended up going to the aircraft maintenance officer school, which was up at Rantoul, where they trained those first blacks in the program, but that was an integrated class, and so...
This was still Army Air Corps?
Yes. This was the 47 was when the Air Force became a separate service. 48 when Truman issued the executive order that integrated. That's when so my first integrated assignment came the year of that order when I finished the training as a maintenance officer. She knew instead of going back to my duties in base operations at Lockburn, I was assigned to a bomb group at Salina, Kansas. Became the first integrated assignment. So the types of assignments that I got, still being able to fly, even though I was performing administrative and other tasks, in this case mainly that assignment, I was given the job as the director of shops and equipment. In other words, in charge of all of the maintenance shops related to the maintenance on this was a B-29 outfit. And so I was also in charge of those base shops. And I got my first ride in a B-29, hopefully sometime to get checked out with. So I was, in other words, I wasn't in the bomb group, I was in the maintenance squadron with this responsibility, but still had the duty to maintain your flying proficiency and so on. So it was those types of assignments that I got along the way that kept me in flying. When I left there, I became the officer in charge of inspection and flight test out at Marchfield, Riverside, and that had both, and this was the first time when they started integrated maintenance, and we had the bomb group on base and the first fighter wing, so we had bombers and fighters, but inspection and flight test was an administrative responsibility over those functions for both the bombers and the fighters. So I kept getting what I called very excellent assignments and still the opportunity to fly, and it just kept going on and on that way. And that's one of the things that kept me in. I was doing something I enjoyed doing and had progressively excellent assignments. I was able to, one of the other impacts as we went along, and I noticed that Colonel Davis, of course, went on to become a lieutenant general and retired, and has recently published his book, and it brings up one of the things that did affect us and although we led the way into integration of the services, one of the things, and I noticed he has a statement in his book, and it's all effective, we would say, well, this integration is working fine, and we could get command assignments outside the states, but as soon as you came back to the states, you'd only get a staff assignment. And looking at that history of some very well qualified officers, it seems to be a fact that that's the way, even though there was the overall direction of integration, it wasn't completely there. And
it was overseas, but wasn't.
That's right, because I commanded the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron in the Philippines when I started maybe to mention earlier, or did mention that I had chosen to go back to the Philippines after I completed my tour in Korea. And one of the reasons was that my family was eligible to come over, and since they'd been looking forward to it, rather than me come home, I said, I'll go back there. And it gave me two things. It gave me the squadron there was flying the F-80, and I had not, it would be my introduction into jet flying to go back there and get checked out in the F-80. Well, I didn't know going back that they were going to keep me in the fighter group, which they did, and gave me the opportunity, and I had been promoted to major in Korea. got a spot promotion, which was confirmed. So when I came back and got checked out in the F-80, suddenly I found myself as a senior officer in the squadron and was given the command of the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron and commanded the squadron for 2 years there in Clark Field in the Philippines. And it didn't happen for many years. Even Colonel Davis and all of his commands, he'd go overseas, they'd give him a command, come back to the States, it'd be a staff position somewhere, and that lasted all through his career. Commands at that level weren't given until General Chappie James came along much behind. In fact, Chappie James was a student at Tuskegee Institute when Captain Davis went through that first class, and then when he graduated, he became a civilian instructor in that civilian pilot training program, and something happened back there. They decided to make all the instructors flight officers, and that upset a lot of people because they were civilians in that primary program, and so they immediately changed that and said, well, those of you who want can come on active duty, and the others can go back civilian. Well, Chappie James chose to come on active duty, then went through the rest of the program like the rest of us, the basic and advanced, and graduated, and of course he became the first black force sergeant general. But he was given commands. In fact, I think he was the first of the black officers who were integrated into the Air Force, first to have a command in the States, and he was given command of an F-86 outfit that was then Otis Field out in the Boston area of Massachusetts, and this was in the 50s. Maybe like 56 or 57. After I had come home from the Philippines myself, and say I had been commander of the 44th for 2 years over there, and he got that command. And so, and of course, Colonel Davis was command of Lockburn when it was segregated, but got no such assignment when we integrated. In other words, he was the base and wing commander up to that point, and was many years in this. And I noticed he said the same thing in the book, overseas, and because of the slow change in the segregation issue as far as the communities here, the reception and dealing with foreign nationals in the foreign countries gave you a much, you feel like you were a person, where coming back you again were faced with having to deal with the decision process of where to go without being confronted, and how to do things where you were accepted and welcomed in the other environments with an openness that didn't exist for a long, long time here. And I guess even for that matter, you can still run into places where you have a feeling of that you're not being quite received with the openness that all of the expression might, because there are a lot of things you can detect that's more than the words that
Sure.
that affect that feeling. Well, that was kind of a long answer to.
When did you go to Korea? What year?
I had gone to the Philippines in 1950 in May, and as I recall, the war broke out, and the decision became in like June or July of 50, and by the time they had geared up that we would put forces in to stem that squeeze down around Busan take place, we went into combat in August of 1950.
And you were in command of a...
At that time, I had gone over from Riverside, California to the Philippines as a maintenance officer.
Okay, you were still a maintenance officer.
I was still a maintenance.
Okay.
But in other words, I had military occupational specialty as a maintenance officer and still as a pilot. You carried more than one specialty. But that assignment was related to being a maintenance officer. When they needed the P-51 pilots for the organization to move to Korea, I immediately was pulled back into the flying specialty and went with the 67th Squadron. In other words, I was pulled out of that, and the maintenance work back into the flying primary, and we went up flown up in C-54s from Clark Field to Johnson Air Base in Japan, where the 51s were, and the next day got in our P-51s and flew from Johnson field there near Tokyo to Ashia, where there was a base, and started flying our combat missions there because they hadn't even prepared a strip for us by Busan. So we flew our first few days of combat out of Ashia across the water and attack the target, go back, reload, back again. So we, from one day, pick up day, the next day we were flying combat missions. That was one of the interesting things in my career when that my last mission in Europe in a P-51 was 17 November 1944, and when the out there at Clark, the 18th Wing had P-51s through and in December of 49 had given the P-51s to the Philippine Air Force, and that's when the F-80 came into the 18th Wing out there in, I guess, January, that time frame of 1950. And as I say, I went overseas, not in the flying, so that's why I wasn't flying the F-80 then, because I was in maintenance duties and flying the other support aircraft like C-47 and T-6s we had. So they said, well, as they filled the 67th to go up, they said, well, we and again went through the tech order. I told you how you read the tech order, just to refresh, and took the exam. And they said, well, we ought to get everybody a few hours of transition back in, those pilots who were in the F-80 and needed to get back in the 51, and those of us who had come in from other sources. And they said, well, let's borrow some of the 51s from the Philippine Air Force. They'd had them for 6, 7, 8 months. And so they sent some maintenance folks over to look at them, and they were so dissatisfied with the way the Filipinos were taking care of them, they wouldn't let us fly them. So they said, well, you've taken tech order, go on. So by that 29th of August of 1950, I'm going down the runway on the in formation up there at Johnson Air Base, and the first time I'd been back in a 51 from that 17 November 44. So that was quite a thrilling ride. And talking about the torque, and the effects. That was kind of interesting. I'm not sure that was a very smooth takeoff. Survived without hitting the other man flying with me, and as I say, we were right back into combat, and it comes back pretty quick, though.
Were you you dive bombing and strafing around the perimeter? Is that what you were doing?
Right. Right at the perimeter around Busan, just a few miles just north, they put in a pierce steel planking strip. In fact, another one of my combat stories, as we were flying out of Ashia, and I became the maintenance officer for the squadron along with flying. And when they said, well, we need to go over and see what's going on, and they said, fly over and check with the Corps of Engineers to see how the strip is coming along. And that colonel of the Corps of Engineers, flew a 51 over and found the strip and landed, and he was mad as a hornet because he still had another 1,000 feet to go. And he said, they told me they wouldn't send an aircraft over here till I was through. And I just went over late one day after missions, put my bedroll beside, just spun the aircraft around, parked there, and spent the night, and went back the next day. And I think about 10 days later, he did have strip, and we began to move. And again, over there, they had a combination of building tents and what they called the pooches or hutches. I think you've heard that term. The old, what they had,
Quonset huts?
Quonset type, you'd lay a platform and get those built up. So we had a combination of those, and again, and that experience was one, we flew out of K9 there at Busan, and then when they pushed them back north of Daegu, we'd fly missions and land up there and fly another one and come back home. And I was with the outfit when we moved up, and after we pushed the North Koreans, almost back to the Island River, we even staged out of Pyongyang airfield in North Korea. And we'd fly
former capital.
Right, and we would fly a mission, land up there, rearm, refuel, fly a mission, come back. And then for a while we stayed up there, and then we had later in the war moved over to I think it was called K10, Chinhae, became our fair, and then had forward bases up near Sewell. And then even after they pushed back to the 19th parallel, we'd fly missions from home base, fly up and then land close to the front, refill, fly another mission, come back home.
Were you flying these missions in direct support of infantry, or?
Most of them were, but it was also interdiction as well. We would catch road truck traffic. Then there was a lot of work directly with air liaison officers where you were dropping napalm on ridges right out in front of the troops. It was a combination, but between close support and interdiction type of work.
That must be kind of scary doing close support.
That is very, and this was another area in that training that I told you. They sent a lot of pilots fresh from the States, recallees and so on, tried to send them right to Korea. Well, we lost a lot of pilots where they needed a little more. We had pilots, it had never been experienced. The napalm, was, you use the old drop tank, but put the napalm in it and have a way of lighting it up as it, was dropped on target areas. Maybe one would hang up, just not used to the differential weight, and it's all low altitude, work. You don't have much room for recovering, something happened.
Did you encounter much ground fire?
Intermittently, and I didn't get hit in Europe. I sure did there in Korea. In fact, one time, real severe damage. I was able to get the plane back down to our strip, but took a pretty good hole in the wing. That gets interesting too. And of course, in that day, you used a lot of they put tracers in primarily to help bore sighting the guns, but also it helped you in the air to see, because otherwise you couldn't see where you're, even though you had something in your gun sight, thought you're fine, you really couldn't. They were good to help you see where is this fire really going. Is it going where you think it is? And that's something to be on a run. We were strafing this time I got hit, strafing gun emplacements on the hillside on the north side of the valley, and boy, there was many tracers coming back by me that I could see going the other way, and that gets pretty sporty.
You probably couldn't see the enemy either, because you just attacking areas, or
in this case we knew right where and could see the gun position going down, and suddenly realized they're firing back at us. This is as much as we're pouring down on them. Some of those cases where we were dropping napalm or so on, it was strictly a target area. We didn't always see. There were occasions where you might see, the truck that's hidden camouflage or that type of thing. But there was a combination of those. Some things you saw, some things you didn't.
Were you often in direct contact with the ground troops? In other words, were they telling you what they wanted, or?
Only in those cases of where they had a liaison officer assigned who had the air contact with us. I would say the most of our work was specific target area where you knew target area, and from there anything
on the other side of the
right was fine. And in fact, I served. They had 30-day tours, and I served 30 days with the 19th Regiment of the as their liaison with the 19th Regiment of the 24th Division when they were up there 40 miles from the Yellow River. And, that was interesting. The 19th Regiment wasn't in direct contact, so during the time that I was there, we didn't have a lot of air activity for them, so my tour was kind of a quiet one, but it was interesting because that was right at the time that although the 19th Regiment of the division wasn't in direct contact, the word was coming that the Chinese had come across the river and they were beginning to back up and prepare for it.
Well, did you at all fire in as the Chinese forces were coming down? Did you have any covering mission or anything during that time?
We had several missions of napalm runs where the report was that they're embedded, trenched in on certain ridges or so on. I don't recall any like where there's a convoy of 100 vehicles just coming through. They didn't. They were more like the infiltration of Vietnam, a lot of night, surreptitious, if you will, movement that, but I recall a lot of the bombing missions and napalm missions on ridges and areas. Again, in this case, working with an air liaison that was with the Army unit, saying, here's where the target areas are, where the guns are, where they're bunkered down.
Well, what did you do specifically as a liaison officer?
You would, based on the Army is extremely regimented in the way they operate, and in the Army channel, it strictly was up to that Corps commander whether he wanted to use air or not. And you had some that didn't like it and wouldn't use it even if it was air. Those that wanted it could call for airstrikes, and then through the ALO channels, you would be informed that the flight, would be due in at such and such a time, and what the target area was, and you would work with your regimental people. That sometimes they'd say, well, we'll have them put a smoke bomb on the target for you, and we would relay that, and tell the flight, that it's on its way, and once it's hit, ask them, find out whether they spot it, give them free rein then to.
But you wouldn't be actually with the squadron.
No,
You would be
we're
on
on
the
the ground with a radio jeep and two technicians. So there were three of us, two radio technicians that maintained the jeep and the radio equipment, and then the liaison officer. And you'd get your instructions from the colonel. Well, Musication Regiment could either be a colonel, maybe a lieutenant colonel, who indicated they wanted to use air that day, and that you would be busy or not. As I say, I get a pretty quiet period for that. Apparently, and the other thing the Army does, in other words, I guess the regiments kind of leapfrog each other, and they happen to be in the position of not indirect. That's what I meant by not indirect contact.
Mm-hmm.
They were in more of a holding position, and we didn't get a lot of action during the time that I was there. But it works through a coordinated system depending on what. And as I say, the key man is that Corps commander, whether he wants to use it and how much. And then, of course, he, back in their meetings, would relate with the air representative of what could be allocated. Sometimes it was a matter of allocation. Sometimes they want a lot more than could even be given them, and others didn't want to, prefer to use their own artillery.
You were in 51s and the whole time you were in Korea?
My tour, in fact, two squadrons of the 18th Wing, both the 12th Squadron and the 67th, flew the entire Korean War using P-51s. And we started it out, and immediately, of course, as they became available, the jets were added and flew from other bases and so on. We were never all at the same base, and flew their missions. And of course, they got a big part of that of the air war, because just out of the nature of the mission and where they were flying, where ours work was pretty much on.
Did you encounter any hostile aircraft at all when you were over there?
I did not. At all. On all of those 100 missions I flew, never any. And again, I related to, just being factual that some of the things happened. We had a case of two pilots who, our job was maybe to bomb a bridge, knock out a bridge that was being used for infiltration at night, or a lot of supply traffic. There were cases where pilots heard that there were MiGs in the air and would throw away their bombs and just go MiG hunting. Again, my own dedication was, hey, not knocking out that bridge might be a detriment to what that particular Army outfit wanted, and chose myself, although I had a couple of occasions I could have thrown my ordnance away and done that not to do it, but that is something that does happen. Fortunately, not so much that we didn't. The squadron, our call sign was elsewhere. Of course, everybody used call signs, and we got a couple of commendatory letters during the time that I was there because of the work, with the Army and the interdiction that the squadron was doing. And we had our losses there too, because there were cases where aircraft were hit and the fellows didn't make it back to
This would be probably from ground fire, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Mostly ground fire, although there's some places with some pretty heavy gun emplacements that were
Genuine anti-aircraft stuff.
I think it was. I guess it could have been used that way because it was. I know the hit that I took in the wing was a pretty high caliber shell, the whole lot like that. Whether the guns had been brought in for true anti-aircraft work or a multiple, role type of mission, I'm not sure. But, there wasn't a lot of the flak type. Well, there may have been around some of the cities, but that wasn't our kind of mission. And so we didn't run into that much as most of it was the lower caliber and type of fire that the ground troops could be carrying. And this particular gun emplacement, I'm sure it was probably the type of where they could on vehicles mount these multiple guns, whether they were what they used to call the quad 50s but a lot of that type of thing that's mobile, move it place to place.
One final question. And this is really something I'm not clear even after we've talked.